Sir Salman Rushdie is here. His books include Shame, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, and Shalimar the Clown. His novel Midnight's Children won the Booker Prize in 1981. Some of his work has also attracted controversy. 20 years ago this fall, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa against Rushdie for his book, The Satanic Verses. This month, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II for his services to literature. His new novel is called The Enchantress of Florence. I am pleased to have him back at this table, and always when he is here, thank him for his service at this table when I was away. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
The idea, was it 10 years ago? Has it been out of your head? What?
It's been a long time. I mean, I've actually known about and been interested in both halves of the book, both the Renaissance Florence, where I went as a college student for the first time, and Mughal India, which I kind of grew up knowing about. It never occurred to me they'd be in the same book. And then at a certain point, I thought, you know, this is the beginning of the engagement between the East and the West. This is kind of when India and Europe really first found out about each other, you know, and how interesting.
This is the 16th century?
The late 15th to the mid-16th century. And I thought, if you're going to look at now, we're all talking about this East-West engagement and how complex it is, in some ways very enriching, in other ways disturbing. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's look how this started, and maybe that'll be interesting.
Beyond interesting, does it tell us something?
Well, I think what it told me, which was very surprising to me, I mean, I expected to be writing a book about two incredibly dissimilar worlds, East, West, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, colliding, and there would be sparks flying, I thought. What I found was, the more I found out about them, the more similarities I found.
Now, what was the quote one of your characters says? I mean, something about more similar?
But the curse of the human race is not that we are so dissimilar, but that we are so alike.
Yes.
You know, and that really was a kind of, if you like, author's lesson from the book. That's what I learned doing the work. That whatever you look at, if you look at the power politics, you have on the one hand Machiavelli thinking about the great questions of power and justice, and you go across the world, and in the mind of the Emperor Akbar in India, you have the same questions being asked about whether it's possible to be a good prince. Do you have to be unjust to be a powerful ruler? And even if you look at the much lower level of sort of human, social, and sexual intercourse, these are both worlds in which women get locked up and sequestered by their families. And so the world of the courtesan mushrooms in both India and Florence in exactly the same way.
Now, what was the inspiration by Babur?
The first emperor.
Sent his...
Well, he had to give up his sister. When he was besieged in Samarkand by a rival warlord who said, the price of your safety is that you have to give me your beautiful sister. So he had to surrender his sister. He was rather embarrassed about it, sort of rather glossed over it in his autobiography. But it gave me the idea that a woman could become, if you like, a spoil of war. She could, you know, one warlord defeats another, one prince defeats another, and the beautiful woman gets handed from hand to hand. And then she begins to make choices. She begins to decide which prince she really likes to be with.
And this is the Enchantress.
This is a story of this imaginary princess who in this way kind of bounces across the world until she meets and falls in love with an Italian soldier of fortune, who at that point is working as a mercenary for the Ottoman Turks. He brings her back to Florence, where she enters the world of the Medicis and Botticelli and so on.
What is the definition of magical realism?
I don't know. You know, I always think that term, when people use it, what they hear is magical and what they don't hear is realism.
I know.
I mean, I think it's a way of approaching the truth by other means. You know, if you grew up, as I did, with Arabian Nights stories, you know, with all these fantastical tales, you learnt very young that the way in which fiction arrives at truth is different than the way that journalism does it. And this kind of highly fantasticated, fabulated storytelling can actually end up telling you as much truth as a photograph or a news report. So,
well, you have suggested some of the people in India think of your work as history, and when you go to England, they think of it as fantasy.
That certainly happened at the beginning, like when Midnight's Children was published. In the West, in America as well as England, people tended to respond to the fantastic elements of the book. In India, people thought, oh, we know all this stuff. You know, we know this thing. People came up to me. A young man came up to me in India after Midnight's Children came out. And he said, I could have written your book. I know all those things.
And that's exactly what a writer wants to hear.
Exactly.
Because it suggests that you are reflecting what everybody is thinking but can't express.
Yeah, no, I did take it as a great compliment.
So this novel, this idea, bring these two worlds together where they began to have some similarity. it's bouncing around in your head for a while. How do you add to it? How do you enhance it? How do you go from there
to the story?
To this.
Yeah.
To this.
Well, actually, I got two clues. One, as you mentioned, is this story of this mislaid princess of the East.
This beautiful, stunning, wonderful lady.
Might be a witch as well.
Maybe a witch, exactly.
then I'm reading the European literature of the Renaissance, of the period I want to set the book in. And in the great poem Orlando Furioso, written by Ariosto, one of the main plot themes I discover, to my amazement, is an Indian princess showing up in Europe and creating havoc, and maybe she's a witch.
And there you are.
And I thought, wow, you know, I mean, I'm not only the second person to make this up.
And that's okay. It's good company.
They are. Yes, and so I felt it gave me permission. I could join those two ends of the bridge, if you like, the beginning in the East, the ending in the West. I thought if I could join that bridge, then I've got, you know, like a 16th century road novel.
So how do you spend your time in research as you're knowing where you want to go, kind of?
Yeah.
But you want to know because you want the novel to reflect both reality as well as fantasy.
Well, you just dig, you know, the thing is, the actual history, the kind of what exactly happened, the politics and so on, that's relatively easy to get, you know. What you need as a writer is ordinary life. You need to know, you know, if people get angry with each other, what terms of abuse do they use? You know, if people are having a wedding feast, what's on the table? I mean, and you can make mistakes. I mean, like I discovered, for instance, that Italian food in this period contained no tomatoes. You know?
Why was that? Because
they hadn't arrived yet. You know, or when they had arrived, people thought they were table decoration. It didn't occur to them to cook with them. So I could easily have given somebody a bolognese to eat, and it would have been horribly anachronistic.
And somebody would have pointed it out in today's world.
For sure have pointed it out.
Yeah. So you began to develop characters. You have historical characters to build around.
Yes. But you see, even when you've got very famous historical characters, like Machiavelli, like the Medicis, like the Emperor Akbar, much written about, you know, still, to bring them to life on the page, you have to still do what the novelist has to do. You have to enter them imaginatively. You have to wonder, what do they dream about? What do they desire? You know, etc. You have to, in the end, make them up too. But you have to be faithful to the historical record. I didn't want to make them up in a way that wasn't true. You know, I wanted people to feel, if you had met Niccolo Machiavelli and gone drinking with him one evening,
this is what it would be like.
It would be like this. And he was a boy, he was a guy who liked to go drinking. You know, he's a very unfairly treated by history. You know, Machiavelli was not Machiavellian.
He was judged to be a man simply who had all the secrets for using power.
Yeah, but he wasn't. He was just watching a world of ruthless power around him. The Medici princes, the Borgia princes, even the papacy was pretty much playing power politics in that time. And he made the mistake of writing it down unvarnished, with no prettification. And it's a classic case, in my view, of shooting the messenger. You know, and he himself hated tyrants. You know, only time he ever worked for the state of Florence was the brief period when they expelled the Medici dukes. When the dukes came back, they tortured him. They wanted to kill him. Eventually, they exiled him. This was not a man who loved princes, you know. And he was also, you know, he wrote the most successful comedy play of the Renaissance, The Mandrake Route. There's letters in existence from his friends to him when he's away, saying, "Would you please come back, because when you're not here, there's nobody to arrange all the fun."
Now, is the joy, once you have the command of language, which you have in abundance, figuring out how to make these people real and how to get inside their head, that's where it becomes...
Yeah, I mean, I just thought, there's a moment when the story goes click, when I think, I know how these two halves of the world can talk to each other through the love story I'm inventing. Yeah. And now, there always comes a point where you have to just put the research to one side. You think, okay, I know it now I'm just going to write. And that's the moment of liberation.
Why is this the time that the modern era began?
Well, the Renaissance is often thought of as the moment at which the modern history of Europe begins. Because, I mean, to take only one thing, art, culture, etc., but also, I think most importantly, what's happening in Renaissance Florence at this time is the development of the idea of the sovereign individual self. The idea that we as individuals have a sovereign self is a thing which was invented, really, by the philosophers of the Renaissance. And that makes it an explosive invention from which the whole of the modern world flows, if you like.
Okay, so when you say that, you're mainly talking about the Renaissance.
But but also in terms of the contact with India. You see, the first Europeans ever to come to India came at the end of the 15th century for the spice trade. Then the Portuguese established their little colony in Goa. Then, by the time the middle of the 16th century, there's just beginning to be the first travelers, the first merchants arriving in the Mughal court. So these worlds are just beginning to discover each other. You know, Akbar the Great was an exact contemporary of Queen Elizabeth I of England. They both ruled for about half a century, for the whole second half of the 16th century. There's no evidence in real history that they ever knew about each other.
That's extraordinary.
You know, in my novel, they find out.
Yes, I know, but I mean that's called literary license, I think.
Yes, I'm allowed to do that, I think.
When you think back about that time and the way it evolved for you, do you see anything that speaks to who we are today?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I think, you know, frankly, if we think we live in an age of brutality, well, goodness, they were brutal then. Yeah. You know, if we think that this is an age of just or unjust wars, well, this was a time where there were wars everywhere you look.
So there's nothing new in...
Nothing new. We are who we are as a species. You know, this is what
the only constant is change.
Yeah, this is what we behave like, though. You know, for good and ill. I mean, you can see the beauty of the Renaissance, the beauty of, because it's also a kind of Renaissance in India at this time. The art of the Mughal period, the architecture, the music is also a kind of pinnacle. You know, so these are, if you like, two golden ages. You know,
we are looking at a time that India is becoming, because of economic growth, because of a whole range of things, becoming much more of a global presence.
That's right. Well, this is an interesting thing to go and look at. This is the last time that India was a mighty empire. You know,
yes, exactly.
Time,
that's
you know,
my point.
So,
yeah. And so how do you see that? Is it happening? We know about Bollywood, and we know about economic growth, and we know what's happening in industry.
Yeah.
Is it happening in culture beyond movies?
I'm sorry to say that it is in terms of the artists. I think there are wonderful writers in India, there are wonderful musicians, there are filmmakers, and so on. What unfortunately is happening at the same time as this economic boom is a kind of cultural backsliding towards censorship. So now you find regularly, you know, the grand old man of Indian painting, M.F. Hussain, is driven out of India by Hindu fanatics who don't like his paintings of a Hindu goddess. The filmmaker who I interviewed for you here, Deepa Mehta, had her, when she first tried to film water in India, the set was literally destroyed by Hindu fanatics, and she had to, many years later, reconstruct the project in Sri Lanka, and then got an Oscar nomination for it. You find, whether in whichever form it is, whether it's films or paintings or literature, the forces against art at the moment are very powerful, and that's the most depressing aspect of what is otherwise a really exhilarating expansion.
Let me go to the fatwa 20 years ago. You look back on it with the advantage of distance and 20/20 hindsight. What do you think?
You know, I think I wasn't wrong.
In terms of what you said in Satanical Verses.
Yeah.
And it was an indication, if it was looked at, for what might come in terms of what happened to you.
Well, I often thought, you know, about Hitchcock's movie The Birds, I've often thought that I was the first bird on the roof, you know. And that was my misfortune. You know, you cut away to Tippi Hedren chopping vegetables, and you cut back, and there's a zillion birds on the roof. You know, and I think what happened, the attack on the Satanic Verses, was the first indication that radical Islam was about to enter a newly militant and aggressive phase.
And you think it's a phase, and you think that it will expire in the same way that the IRA, in a different place and with lots of differences, expired, because in the end,
the people don't want it.
The people don't want it because they get tired of killing.
Yeah, that's my view. That's my view. I mean, I could be wrong, but I do think that in the way that Soviet communism, which seemed immutable and fixed, just blew away like dust one day. You know, I think
fell of its own weight.
Just, you know, and suddenly nobody could understand how it stood up so long.
Right.
You know, this phenomenon, this fanatical, extremist, violent phenomenon, is hated by almost everybody in the Muslim world. You know, and given that hatred is not diminishing but increasing, in the end it can't last.
They hate it because the obvious, but is there more?
They hate it because they're human beings too. You know, they don't like it. I don't believe that I don't know any Muslim people, and I know quite a lot of them, who like to be defined in terms of that violent culture that has kind of hijacked their religion.
In the end, you also think that religion is not a defining identification. in most places.
Yeah.
You think of yourself because of the region you come from. Certainly take Afghanistan. People talk about
They talk about
it's
regions
a Muslim area.
region and tribe.
Exactly. More so than religion, the identification.
Yeah. I think
geography.
One of the things that's so interesting about Akbar is exactly that, is that he thought that he did not want to build a country based on a religion. He did not want to even say that one religion was superior to another. You know, he wanted, if you like, a nation.
Tolerance and...
Yeah, and I mean, in fact, some of the very hardline Muslims of his own court believed that he had somehow fallen away from the true religion because of his openness to others. He even tried to invent a religion, which was a kind of pantheistic religion of all the faiths put together. It didn't catch on.
But you think, for example, in America, where there is clearly a diversity, most people here don't think of themselves as defined by religion at all. I'm an American, I'm an American, I'm an American.
You would hope so. I mean, I think there's a lot of religious discourse in American politics in a way that there is not in European politics. I mean, it's one of the most obvious differences if you look at the way in which political campaigners or leaders talk, is that here there's much more talk of religion.
And why is that? What is it about us that makes us...
Well, you know, I think, I mean, listen, you know, how long you've got, you know, but one thing is, I think that in Europe, the idea of liberty developed as a battle, as a struggle against the church, you know, against inquisitions and so on and so on. In America, the reason people came to America was to get freedom for their religion.
Exactly.
You know, so in this country, freedom meant freedom for religion, whereas in Europe it often meant freedom from religion. And that's where the difference begins, I think.
And in the end, you're suggesting that the reason that we will see a kind of open and a pluralistic Islam.
Well, I mean, I'm not a very good prophet.
Yeah, but you are a student. I mean, you make the point that at the time of Satanic Verses, you know, that you believe because you'd studied Islam and you'd looked in, knew more than some of your critics about the history of Muhammad.
Yeah. I mean, I think the odd thing about that novel is if you read it now, it seems to have been written after what happened to it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It
does.
In the sense that it seems to know the nature of the enemy, if you like. You know?
On a personal basis, what was the challenge for you going through that?
Well, it was horrible. You know, I mean, it was horrible, and I was afraid for my family and my parents. I mean, my mother was living in a Muslim country, Pakistan, and I had to fear for her and my children, etc. You know, it was very worrying.
What happened to her when Shame came out?
Oh, that's nothing. That's nothing. That's just attacking a dictator.
Yes. All right. Go ahead. Tell me this about it.
No, but I mean, so the great worry was for other people. I mean, they were my publishers, my translators, all these people who had worked on behalf of the book, who were under attack. I mean, one person, the Japanese translator of the book, was actually killed. My close friend, my Norwegian editor, was shot 3 times in the back. It was a terrifying time. Secretaries in publishing houses answered the phone and heard a voice saying, "We know where your children go to school." You know, things like that were happening. And the fact that during that time, actually ordinary people, you know, people working in publishing companies, people working in bookstores, readers who didn't feel like being kicked around and told what to read, those people held the line. You know, not the politicians. Those ordinary people held the line. Without that, there would have been no Satanic Verses to defend. You know, the book would have been withdrawn and pulped and be ancient history. So my gratitude has always been to that resistance of ordinary people, and I feel very proud to have been part of that.
More so than people who you might have expected to stand up for you?
Well, I mean, lots of writers stood up for me and artists, and the politicians came, not surprisingly, a little late to the party, you know, but in the end, it was the Blair government in England and the Clinton administration here that did a great deal to get the problem resolved.
I, like so many others, went to Washington, got on one place and went to another hotel and another hotel before we had our first conversation.
I know. Whereas this time I run 5 blocks down the street to get to me.
Yeah, yes, that's right. How times change.
Exactly.
But there was also some risk, I would assume, that it might impact your writing. You would exist some kind of self-censorship?
Yeah, I worried a lot. I thought there were two ways in which it could cripple my work. Either, as you say, it could scare me, you know, and I'd write scared little books or nothing, you know, and that would have been a kind of living death. or I could do the opposite. I could have become very embittered and hostile and written, if you like, revenge books, and that would have been a crippling too. In either sense, I become a creature of the event,
Right.
And I was
Spend your whole life in revenge.
Yeah, exactly. It just that destroys you too.
Right.
And I thought I have to somehow avoid these elephant traps, and if it possible, I have to just keep going down my own road. I have to keep going on trying to be the writer I've always wanted to be. And one of the reasons why this book actually feels important to me is that I think what happened to me, leaving aside the fatwa, in people's imagination, that this political event was so powerful that people began to see me, if you like, as, non-fictional. People began to think of me as a person, as a commentator about Islam, as a person in the non-fictional world. Whereas actually the reason I became a writer was not that. The reason I became a writer was to find stories to tell and find the best way to tell them and hope that people would like them. And so this book felt to me, in a way, like going back to the source of that, going back to the reason I became a writer.
In your judgment, people never really understood Satanic verses. Why is that?
Well, a lot of the people who attacked it just didn't read it. That's one way of not understanding
Yes.
the book, And I think also amongst the attackers of the book, there was, if you like, a kind of category mistake. There was a sense that fiction was being judged as if it were non-fiction. So if you have, for instance, you have a character who dislikes the birth of a new religion and is therefore abusing the prophet and his early followers. Right? Now, that, of course, historically happened. The religion was persecuted. If somebody reading the book assumes that the point of view of the persecutors is my point of view, then they can say, look, Rushdie is attacking Islam. But actually what he's doing is showing something that did happen, which is that a religion was born and was persecuted. So it's that, in that way, there was a kind of curious distortion of the text.
Do you read reviews?
I speed read them.
What are you looking for? Looking for wonderful, great, fantastic,
just which way the
I
thumb,
know your major work,
No, just which way the thumb goes.
And once you see that, do you want to examine it? Do you want to?
Usually not.
I'm coming to this because some people look at the character, Ago, and say, it's a conceit.
Well, look, it's a fable, this story. But at the end, so there's all kinds of notions, fancies thrown into it, But in the end, you have to care about him. And I think the thing that happens in the book is that you do care about him. And the reason you care about him is because, as I say, he's taking a risk with his life. He's gambling his life to gain, if you like, his fortune. But nevertheless, he's gambling his life. And
so did you not have a hard time getting inside his head because it was your head?
Yeah, it was much easier, much easier. I don't know if it was exactly my head, but it was certainly easier to get inside him.
You knew how he thought going from day one because he was a storyteller.
And I knew the game he was playing,
And what's the game?
Well, the game is...
The game is how to make a storyteller, how to make a story enticing, compelling, and having people sing.
And coming out of it, very successful. I mean, he's playing a game to get himself into a high place in one of the wealthiest courts in the world, and so he's ambitious too.
And he's putting his neck on the line.
But he's putting his neck on the line. He's betting everything, I like that. I mean, in a way, I think my idea of how you write is that you bet everything. You don't play it safe. You take big risks.
Well, if you don't play it safe, you'll never achieve greatness, will you?
No, exactly.
Of any kind.
No, exactly. I think it's the big risks. The glorious failure I've always preferred to the modest success.
I think that's in your DNA, or do you learn that?
No, I think that's just me.
Just you.
That's just
but do you know why you feel that way? What it was that shaped you, that made you believe that and view life that way?
Well, when I had a very bumpy start as a writer. I mean, my early stuff was, frankly, dreadful and didn't get published. And my first novel that did get published was one that was not very well liked by anybody, Grimus.
Right.
And after that, I had a novel that I wrote, and even I didn't like it, and I kind of abandoned it.
Yes.
And and meanwhile, in my generation of British-based writers, this was a golden generation. If you look around me, there are all these writers: Martin Amis, Ian McEwan, Julian Barnes, Kazuo Ishiguro.
Right.
Finding their voices
Exactly.
very young, and I'm left there, kind of stranded on the starting line. And I remember.
And did you say to yourself, "I'm as good as they are"? Why are they getting it?
Yeah,
I don't mean success. I mean doing things that everybody knew was good.
Yeah, no, I mean, I obviously hated them and so on.
But they're friends.
They're close friends.
Ian's a great friend.
But Ian and Martin and Ish, all of them are
right.
close friends. But at a certain point I thought, okay, I have to try again, and this time what I'm going to do is go for broke. I'm going to take the biggest creative risk that I can think of taking, and at least if I go down, I'm going to go down in flames. This was Midnight's Children.
It's about the creation of India.
And yeah, we did take. I mean, the idea that you could take on in a novel the whole subcontinent of India.
Yes.
It's a comic absurdity, and yet that's what I tried to do. I don't know. I guess I got away with it.
Does your personal life inform your work? Does the fact that you had a much publicized breakup inform your work?
No, I mean, no, it's impossible to say no. Pain is always informative, you know.
How so?
Well, I mean, you learn from it, you know. You learn from it.
You learn mistakes not to make, or you learn...
No, you just learn the nature of being a human being, you know, which is to be hurt and to hurt other people and to yearn for something that you can't have and to wish things were not as they were, and etc. You know, all these human emotions, of course, you know, are things that we all go through. But actually, in terms of writing my book, it's not helpful at all. I mean, because the pain gets in the way of creativity.
Because
you need calm. You know, the thing itself brings, you know, to write a page of a novel requires from the writer enormous emotion and intellect, enormous, you know, if you like, passion, but also self-criticism, all that. That's what you're doing all the time. If there's outside noise, that gets in the way. You know, you have to somehow learn how to shut out outside noise in order to pay attention.
And outside noise in this case is you can't keep your heart out of your head.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And you have to learn how to do that. Otherwise, you can't do what you're supposed to be doing.
So how do you learn how to do it?
Well,
what is your what is 101 for dealing with that kind of pain?
It's just actually 35 years of discipline is what does it in the end.
That's interesting. Tell me that.
In
other words, getting up in the morning,
sitting down, doing your job.
Doing your job.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, if you're a carpenter and you've got a table to make, you don't not make the table because you're unhappy.
Exactly.
You know?
Or you don't feel well.
Yeah, exactly. You make your table.
Right.
Same thing.
It is the same thing.
It's just, you know.
And everybody that I know who is an artist feels that way.
Yeah.
I mean, somehow we forget that art has building blocks. Step by step.
Yeah, and craft, you know, pride in your craft is a very important thing. You have to just be able to do your job.
If you couldn't write, what would happen to you?
I'd be very depressed. I mean, I've always thought...
I don't mean writer's block.
I've always thought I was really lucky in my life that I was able to do the thing I had dreamed of being able to do. You know, it's one thing to dream of wanting to be a writer. It's another thing entirely to be a writer. And I think I'm just...
That's true.
You know, I'm just lucky that I was able to do the thing I had really most wanted to do with my life. I mean, the only other fantasy I ever had was acting. When I was a college student, I actually did more acting than writing in undergraduate theatre.
And so what does that tell us about you?
Well, I mean, I guess, you know, I like performing.
Ego, attention.
Is that what it tells us?
I don't know. What does it tell us?
I don't know. I just think I liked performing. I liked performance. And it's very odd that, you know, the last couple of years I've got offered a couple of parts in movies, and it feels really strange that in my 60s I get to do a little bit.
What you dreamed of in your 20s.
In my 20s.
Roll tape. Take a look at this.
I don't know how to work a blender. Take your hat off.
Jeez.
Hello.
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 How are you?
Hi.
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 Hello.
Hello.
Sorry.
So, anyone else coming?
No.
No, this is it.
This is it.
Could you load, please?
So there you are.
Yes. Method acting too. I had to go and shadow gynecologists to find out how to do it.
Did you really?
Yes,
you went to that and said, what do they like and how do they think?
I had to learn how to work all this
exactly.
machinery. You know? Even though it's only 11 years since I had a son of my own, in that 11 years, the technology is transformed. It's all like spaceships now.
Yes, I can imagine. The novel today, is it okay?
I'm not sure that it is okay. I mean, I think we clearly live in an age where people seem to have turned towards nonfiction
And memoir.
And I mean, not just writers, but readers seem to be more attracted to what purports to be factual than to these kinds of imaginative creations. And I think that is a concern, you know, and I'm hoping that it's just a phase.
What gives you reason to believe it is just a phase?
It's a very resilient form, I think. And also, I think if you just look around the world, the number of great writers alive now is probably at least as great as there ever has been in the history of literature. So the work being done in many languages, in many countries, is of just the most extraordinary quality. And in the end, I can't help feeling that quality is what lasts.
This book is called The Enchantress of Florence. Sir Salman Rushdie, winner of the Booker Prize. As we've said, thank you for the hour.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.